Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this installment of Ask the Experts. Today we'll be discussing the hidden benefits of ASC 842 around vendor rationalization and lease spend reduction. We are a little light on attendees at this point. People are still signing in, so we just want to give them a minute or two still to log in. But thank you very much for joining. We'll chat in a bit. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for waiting. We just wanted to give a few more of the attendees time to join. So welcome to everyone to this latest installment of Ask the Experts. Today we'll be discussing reduction of lease spend and the vendor rationalization surrounding the ASC 842 adoption standard. This is definitely something that's very close to our heart because we believe that this is going to be a positive spin on what has been so far understood to be quite a difficult adoption done. And this is quite an exciting topic because it does offer a something positive for the controllers to look at after the adoption has been made. So just with that introduction, my name is Craig. I'm a manager here at Riveron and ASC 842 subject matter expert. Just a couple of reminders that I would like to add. We've got the 4 polling questions. These need to be answered for CPE. The webinar evaluation form and the CPE certificate is going to be mailed to you after the fact. Please be aware that you do need to be on the video for 50 minutes at least in order to gain CPE credit. That is tracked. The on-demand video is not eligible for CPE after the fact, so just a reminder to everybody, this is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. And then access to this recording will be sent by follow-up email. So once again, thank you to everybody who's joining, and with that, I'd like to hand over to my esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves, who will be running through the contents of this presentation today.
Hello, Michael Cahill. I'm a managing director here with Riveron. I've been working with the lease standard for probably going on 4 years now, so it's exciting to talk about something other than compliance. I've been helping clients with the standard and new standards in general, RevRec, CECL, most recently. But within the context of ASC 842, we've seen through the first half of 2019 a lot of companies still wrestling with the adoption. So we're early in the stages of how we're going to leverage this data to advance our earnings and EBITDA and results for our clients. But this will give you a look at that, and we're excited to share a bit about what we see as the upside. So more to come, and I'll kick it over to my colleague, Udit Sharma.
Thanks, Michael. So this is Udit Sharma. I'm a managing director with Michael here. I come at this topic from different angles than specifically the 842 compliance. My background is in EBITDA enhancement for companies, and we look for areas wherever we can find either spend reduction opportunities or revenue growth and such. And this area, what we're going to talk about today is one of those areas which can help companies actually enhance EBITDA as we focus efforts into it. My industry experience is cross-sector, so when we get into the Q&A, hopefully we are able to answer your questions from different industry-specific angles as well. With that, here is the agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about the data that gets collected as a result of the compliance effort for ASC 842. We'll talk about analyses that can help identify opportunities to reduce your lease obligation spend. We'll talk a little bit about the best practices that are prevalent in different industries. And then we'll summarize our discussion topics, and then towards the end, we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So with that, polling question one.
Great. Right, thank you, Udit. So just to introduce polling question one, we've got here, how do you expect the implementation of ASC 842 to impact the lease obligation spend? And this is no impact, minimal impact, significant lease obligation spend reduction, or I don't know. So I'm going to launch the polling now and just give everyone a few minutes to respond. Just giving everybody a few more minutes to answer. Great, thank you. So just sharing the results on everybody's screen. Interesting results here. I think, Udit, if we have a look at this, most likely we were expecting this answer. Yes, we're not really sure where to begin. That makes sense. I think this being a value add to the 842 adoption process, there wouldn't be too many company administration teams that would have thought through this. Is this what you were expecting?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if you go through the question, I guess it's how do you expect the implementation of ASC 842? Just the implementation in itself is not going to give you a spend reduction unless there is a focused effort to use the data that you've gotten to this effort. You would not be able to realize any spend reduction. So, most of you got this right by 42%, and so let's get on to what really makes sense of how we actually utilize some of the data that has been collected to identify opportunities of improvement in spend reduction. So, the first step really, in the spend reduction opportunity is as a result of AS 842, the companies collect information which has several elements of lease assets, and they're collated. They are properly identified. Leases is one of the key outcomes of that data collection effort. It also includes, non-lease contracts, some of them with embedded leases within them. So, all of that is consolidated in one area that helps, corporations to actually look at it and identify some trends and opportunities for spend reduction. It also helps to, to accurately classify lease contracts, both in the operating side and also in the financial leases. So you're able to classify it as an operating lease and a finance lease. The available contract terms for all leases are also available to you in a format that can be brought into Excel, can be brought into other analytical tools that can be used to identify opportunities for spend reduction. And again, because you have all of this information now in a central repository versus you had to earlier go into local local offices, get that lease information. That in itself took a lot of time to just kind of get that information together. Now that you have it in a centrally located repository, which can be used easily, it provides you the impetus to be able to actually go and do some analyses.
I think, just to interject one point that I think is relevant here, is that we had one client that the CEO, when she understood what ASC 842 was all about and what her organization was going to have to do to gather the data, understand their processes, where their contracts were, and get the accounting out, her comment was that this is a global inventory of their leased assets, and that was an area of their business that they were probably delinquent in. And this is a very large public company, but each organization that we've gone into has underestimated the effort to gather this data, the amount of data, and then also seen that there's incredible value to obtaining that data and having that data at their fingertips. So we'll share more about that as we go on.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it not only provides the central location, it also gives you a good handle on how you actually manage all of these leases going forward. So there are some inherent opportunities that present themselves as you collect this information in a central location. The next page here really shows you what a lease, and this is a little bit hard to read, but it shows you an example of how this data can be collated or is collated generally through this effort. This sample here shows for one of our clients their auto assets, and you can see it starts with a unique schedule number or lease schedule number. It has start and end date of the lease. It has the terms of the lease in it. It tells you the duration of the lease. It tells you the frequency, whether it's monthly or quarterly or annual. It tells you, for how long, how much time is left in that lease. It tells you what the payment schedule is, and it tells you what the payments are, what the monthly payments are. It also tells you what that equipment or asset is. So there's a description of that equipment and asset. We'll talk a little bit more about the equipment name and equipment asset as we go into the method that we would use to analyze the spend reduction opportunity. But this is one of the key areas where granularity of what an asset looks like is very important. So this is just a subset of what the data looks like, but these subsets and the ones that you would see encircled in red are really the ones that are utilized in a initial blush analyses of what the spend reduction opportunity is. In this particular example, the same exact asset, which is a 1 Series 114D diesel BMW 2016, you would see that asset leased several times. With all those different lease payments, with all else equal, you can see the opportunity there is, in one case, we are paying a monthly payment of $355. In another case, the highest side is we're paying $748. We're essentially the same leased asset. And if you look at the date of the leases, they're all within 8 to 9 months of each other. So that right away gives us an opportunity, at least from a procurement specialist standpoint, is what are we doing? Why are local offices getting those leases at that much of a disparity? And that automatically gives us a cue to actually go start to dig further. Right.
Udit, if I can add one thing, and this is just having seen your team in action, I think this is such an interesting analysis, particularly where you've got companies with large fleets. And the analysis that I saw in action had to do with delivery vehicles. Now, this is particularly within the manufacturing field, you're going to have a vast fleet of these delivery vehicles. So this was panel vans, I think. And one thing that I found so interesting was the disparity as much as 35% on lease spend from one vehicle to the next. And I think what I thought was particularly revealing was when this actually goes to a client, they're not 100% sure how that could happen.
Right.
So once again, just talking to how important it is to have this granular information and allowing the controllership and the company, our clients, to actually have a look and see, right, well, now we understand we might be overspending on some of these leases. So this is a great example, but something we've seen particularly with these large fleet vehicles thus far.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I understand.
Craig, no, that's an important thing. One of the reasons why we see all those discrepancies is that one local office does not know what the other local office is doing, what assets they're leasing. The second thing is they're not actually utilizing the collective value of the company in terms of leveraging the lease spend. So that's some of the discussion we'll have in a bit.
Great. Right. I must apologize to everybody. I understand that the first slide did not match the polling question. I think our technology is reminding me that it's Friday, or it just doesn't like me. I haven't quite figured out which one. Most likely the latter. So I do apologize for that. So if you could just please disregard the polling question. Earlier, we are now launching this. Nope. I apologize.
Polling question 2 is launched now.
It has launched. I apologize to everybody for the mix-up.
Number two is launched.
Correct. Just going to give everyone a few minutes to get through the polling question. Great. So just sharing the results here. We're asking here have you or do you plan to analyze the ASC 842 centralized data for spend reduction opportunity? I don't intend to, no, but plan to analyze data for spend reduction in the future. Yes, and we have opportunities already, or yes, but don't know where to begin. I think once again, quite what we were expecting. They're just not 100% sure where the techniques are, exactly what kind of data we should be harnessing and what granularity we should be looking at. So thank you to everybody for answering there. I think more or less what we were expecting.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and that's the reason for this particular discussion here today. Is that, let's understand, for those who want to do this analysis but don't know where to begin. Hopefully, this particular talk should help us, start at the right place. So, if we look at the data analysis and how we would go about it, we have broken it into 3 key steps. And the first step, really, the data analysis step, is to me the most important step, which is checking the accuracy of the data and then fixing errors. If you think about it, most of this effort is focused on, hey, we need to get compliant by such and such date. While we're getting compliant, sometimes what we've seen with our clients is that they would enter the assets and their description in a free-form field in any of the software that are used as accelerators to become compliant. Lease Accelerator being one of them. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they just to kind of get the data in quickly, they would not completely define the assets. As an example, you'd seen that first bullet there, is the same model for BMW can be described in all of those different ways. So it could be a BMW, it could be a BMW Series X, it could be a BMW Series X3, BMW Series X3 diesel. So you get the idea, is one same asset can be described in varied levels of detail. Now, for you to be able to compare apples to apples when you get into the analysis, it is critical that you are identifying unique assets. And when I say unique assets, the description should be detailed enough so you do not confuse in the analyses of a BMW, for an example, in this case, BMW 7 Series with a BMW 1 Series. Obviously, that's not going to give you the right result. But if you had the detail in the asset description that says BMW Series X3 Diesel 2018, that becomes a very unique asset that you're able to assess. So that's one of the key things in the data that we need to be careful of. While we're doing this effort, there's a reason to be cognizant of the fact that assets have to be uniquely defined. The next thing is lease terms, right? So sometimes the lease terms are not adequately defined. There's initial payments that factor into the monthly payments. There's some maintenance in the contracts. There's customer service level agreements in the contracts. So knowing the end goal in mind, which is, hey, we want to become compliant, and second, we want to be able to use this information for analytics to be able to actually help spend reduction, you need to be able to compare apples to apples, and hence you have to account for these requirements for your lease payments and what goes into them. Another one that we have seen with our clients is they fail to put the right currency in place. And as you can imagine, a euro versus Canadian dollar versus a Singapore dollar versus a US dollar, if they all come in as dollar signs, that could give you a huge error when you're doing the analytics.
Quite humorous, actually, if I can interject, because we did have one anecdotally for everybody on the call recently where the lease portfolio that we were working with, the client unfortunately had transposed the foreign exchange rates, and it was with a South American currency. So we came up with a $240 million US dollar spend for a truck. So that is one of the reasons. Fairly easy to pick up. It was, an outlier immediately, but just to speak to that, in an interesting fashion.
Absolutely, and when we do that analysis with our clients, we do find errors like that. So it's important to have that.
And I think just the broader point here is that obviously to do this and to leverage the data for the maximum benefit, you need good, clear, and deep information to be consistent. But and I think you touched on this, but just to hammer it home, it cripples your process, whether you have a system, a lease asset accounting system that you're going to implement or you have implemented, or if you're going to run, a manual spreadsheet model, you need that data to be consistent and normalized.
Right.
Otherwise, the output is not going to be what you want, what you expect, and what you need. So, getting this data right the first time and getting it at the depth that then you can leverage it to recognize the upside is really, critical. And you only want to do it once.
Yes. And here's some other examples of errors. There are typo errors in some cases. There's missing data, duplicate data, and there are others that we just discussed here. So, so that's step one, is to really get a clean set of data while you're doing the effort to make it worthwhile. Your next step is being able to group the assets together in the right formats to be able to compare, like I said, apples to apples. Now, if you had the data right, and I really meant it, that is the most important step. If you had the data right, this is as simple as taking assets that look similar and running a pivot by the asset description and understanding the variance in the lowest payment and the highest payment. But to be able to understand some of the errors that might have gone into, it's important to look at how you group these assets together. We have a few examples here. So in case of auto, the example that's kind of carried over from before, BMW Series X3 diesel. You're grouping the assets by the name and number of the model, not by a BMW or not by diesel engines and stuff like that. So sometimes it's critical to dig a little deeper into how we're describing the assets. When we're going to office equipment, if you look at the level of detail that goes into clarifying an asset, for example, HP Color LaserJet Pro MFP M281 FDW, chances are that asset leased in 2018 in different locations should basically have similar lease arrangements. There aren't many variations of that particular office equipment. But if we chose to just say HP Color LaserJet Pro, even MFP has several different asset types attached to it, which would have a varied range of dollar amounts. So it's important how we're grouping the assets that we're comparing for opportunity. A very important and a little bit more complicated analysis comes in when we get into real estate and maybe even warehousing and retail spaces. To be able to compare the real estate, you have to understand that real estate obviously in New York is going to be very different from what you're going to have in Tennessee. So zip code level analyses, the square footage, the height, the width, the details of the locations is very important when you're trying to do the comparisons. And then while you're grouping it together, these assets need to be compared at what I call the lowest common denominator. In this particular example, would be cost per square foot. But that you can get to cost per square foot only when you have normalized for other variables such as zip codes and such as the construction of those particular assets. So there is a degree of analyses that needs to go in to identify areas of opportunities in places like office buildings or warehouses and retail spaces and things of that nature. The other part is some of the corporations they forget to add the specifics of the asset, like we mentioned, and that could result in double counting, triple counting of similar assets. It could also distort some of the spend opportunity that we come up. So grouping the assets, that is again is almost a extension of step one, which was having the data right to begin with. But this is our second catch at being able to compare similar assets to each other. Okay. The goal there being be very careful of what you put in those descriptors of the assets.
Udit, if I can ask a question here, just something that came up now is just asking about the asset classes. Is there a specific asset class or product category that you would expect to see more of a saving on than others?
Yeah, so as we've done these analyses, it depends on industry to industry. Now, if it's a services industry, the tangible heavy assets are not their forte or are not their mainstay, and you do not get much of those by either the ways of their leased assets or in terms of the spend. Mm-hmm. So most of their spend savings comes from their office space. But if you go into a manufacturing company that has leased asset both on the manufacturing floor, on their fleet, and in their warehouse spaces, that's where you're going to expect most of the lease spend reduction opportunities.
Okay, and would that typically be volume driven? Obviously, the higher the volume, the more opportunity there is for a
absolutely
reduction.
Yes, so the amount to spend is obviously one of the, because that's your denominator. The area also is if you are very decentralized initially before the effort in terms of how you lease your leases, you're going to see inherently more opportunities. We have seen that, and that's because lack of coordination takes away some of the leverage that you would have with the lessors.
Yep.
And we'll that's a good segue into the next step here of how we kind of assess the lease opportunities, right? So size of opportunity. So basically what we're looking for when we're doing the analyses in what we call size of the prize here is by understanding the variations that you have in monthly leases of same assets that were grouped together in step number 2. So Craig, to earlier question that you had, identifying assets with the largest variations, and in different industries, they're going to be different. Companies that have large fleet spend, they tend to see values of spend reduction opportunities upwards of 10 to 15% in just that one category for spend reduction. If you look at a large company that is spending $50 to $100 million in that area, that's a savings potential of $5 to $10 million. That's substantial money that can be saved on an annual obligation. There are companies that we have worked with that have leased assets in the category of billions of dollars in office equipment. And the savings, the potential that we see from their initial set of data is tens of millions of dollars, if not closer to $100 million. So the opportunity is real. So what step 3 really does for us is we first identify variations in the monthly leases for different asset types. We then figure out, in terms of which are the assets that have those largest variations. Then we go in and dig deeper into, the ones that do have the large variations. What are some of the reasons of those variations? If it's a fleet, there could be several reasons for large variations. There could be maintenance contracts. There could be the timing of the leases. There could be promotional efforts. There could be efforts where, a certain local office got the best deals and the next local office didn't even know about it. And so that's where we then tend to double click and get deeper into how we identify opportunities to improve. You do want to, once you have an idea of what that big variation is, you do want to normalize it for other variations that you might have in the similar category of assets. So we talked about warehouses earlier in step 2. As you go and look into the square footage and where that square footage is rented, zip code matters a lot. So we have to be able to understand what the reason for the variation is. Is it because of the area that the asset is leased in? Is it because of the leasing terms in terms of maintenance and services agreements that we have? So all of that has to be looked at to compare apples to apples. Now, depending on asset types, corporations might be able to achieve, any of the savings that are less than what their current 100% obligation is. Now, generally, when we would look at savings opportunity, we would look at a range of anywhere from 5% to 15% of the total spend. So let's take, for example, a company that has a $100 million lease obligation. Initial blush would give us a $5 million to $15 million opportunity. But generally, that $5 to $10 million, $5 to $15 million opportunity is not 100%. There could be, when we go and dig deeper in, that opportunity could be some percentage, generally some percentage of that overall opportunity. In some cases, in one specific case, we actually found that opportunity to be even more than our initial analyses because the asset groups were not properly categorized. So for example, we had to eliminate a lot of data which said, for example, just BMW. So there were hundreds of records that had a very low description of the asset.
Yeah, simply BMW.
Simply BMW. So even though there was a huge opportunity because of huge rate, but we could not quantify that, qualify it. So when we dig deeper into it, that actually opportunity became larger, and that's the reason for that 110%. But generally, what we see is from the initial opportunity, if you've identified 5 to 15 million, generally when we come out, the opportunity becomes 5 to 10 million or something of that nature.
And I think you mentioned apples to apples before. I think management style also plays into this, right? When you've got a company that's heavy decentralized or they're global, we're not going to treat Asia Pacific the same way as North America when you're buying flatbeds. We know that we're going to have to regionalize that analysis because you're buying and your purchasing approach is different in those regions. So we may leverage the knowledge we have from one region to the next, but that's just additional data and depth that we can get into. But I mean, I think we've talked about that in a number of cases.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's an important point. Now, this being new to the procurement field, I mean, some procurement organizations are very entrenched with the control organizations and are really embedded in terms of doing the lease terms. But because leased asset generally does not come in as a major category for procurement teams, the emphasis that is there on procuring other things like direct materials or indirect services and such, that emphasis for procurement teams is not there currently on leased assets. So this effort of getting 840 to compliance and getting the data in one location and working closely with procurement specialists and professionals gives corporations a humongous opportunity that they haven't even looked at.
I think that raises a very interesting point because Lease Accelerator, of which we are a partner, did the survey recently of S&P 500, where they found that $500 billion of lease liability is now sitting on their balance sheet. That presents huge opportunity where you can connect those dots, where you actually close that gap with procurement, and now all of a sudden you find that even if you've got 5% of that, that is a substantial saving.
Right. Now, the procurement as a profession has been there for ages, right? As long as the human organization exists. I mean, the civilization exists, and that's procurement. But the area of focus continuously changes. Now, procurement can have very specific, solutions for certain types of assets, and others, they get creative. So, for example, to your point, Michael, about different countries, procurement, what procurement teams have done is they have generally identified lowest cost countries that provides assets. And even though with the transportation costs and others, those are areas where procurement teams would leverage and say, this is particular Asian country is the lowest cost provider of these assets, and worldwide we're going to use them to get the required spend reduction. Leases have not, they have not had the same mentality, just because the procurement professionals have not been embedded.
Yeah, it's been managed differently outside of that traditional procurement function. And so I think, sometimes we jump to good, clear examples of that international, but what about a domestic, a private company that's completely domestic? They're still going to have different geographies potentially, where their buying patterns or their vendor identification or profiles are different, but they're going to be able to leverage that data in the same way, fashion, albeit differently, but they'll still benefit from having that vendor data.
Absolutely, and that's the reason why autotrader.com, car.com, all of these business models that came up is because they could go into the country and figure out where your cheapest lease or where your cheapest buy is, and it's at your fingertips. So you don't have to go talk to your car dealership, for example, and do the regular salesman type of negotiation. You can do it centrally, with all of your information together, with the leverage of not a local office, but a combined centralized office, which is now not leasing 2 cars, but 200 cars. And the amount of leverage that gives you is substantial. So all of those are some of the leverage that procurement teams regularly use for general procurement. But that's the discipline that needs to be brought into the lease assets.
Just one final point, just to pile on here. I want to stay on schedule, but I think when we talked about this, preparing for this session, we talked a little bit about where our clients are, where the industry is, where we see them. I think 7 months into the year, they're still wrestling with the adoption of the standard and sort of those day 2 activities for accounting, reporting monthly, quarterly, and getting changes, modifications, terminations, new leases into systems or into their process. But a lot of companies are not focusing on this right now. But it's a big upside, but it's going to be sort of the phase 2 of 842.
Well, I think that also introduces an interesting point of procurement versus controllership.
Yeah.
Because there's an opportunity here to multitask, so to speak, which I know my wife is firmly entrenched in the idea that I don't know what that is. But I think that there's a very good opportunity here for the controllership to pass on some of this to the procurement teams, to asset management teams, where they don't necessarily have to deal with it anymore. They can continue to deal with close while you've got other departments dealing with something along these lines. So there's still opportunity.
Yeah, so the cross-functional nature of this effort is critical too.
Great. Well, this is some great discussion. So bringing on polling question 3 now. And this particular one, I think, is we're going to see some fairly varied answers. So interested to see. This is surrounding the spend reduction potential. So it is, while people are answering here, there's something I thought was quite interesting, and it's a very short answer. You're probably going to say yes or no, but the way I'm seeing this is asset management and this leasing adoption. The two aren't really mutually exclusive, are they? It's really one and the same. Your asset management really needs to be baked into your 842 process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where you're not only getting the benefit, but you're getting that change management that needs to go in, because now there is an objective. not just compliance, but it is also spend reduction.
Yeah.
So when you have all of this information centrally available, it's easy to manage, easy to look at, easy to monitor, easy to control.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another way I can interrupt the conversation. Well, I mean, you're talking about, so I mean, you're really talking about a holistic approach to 842.
Yes.
To the business process change that's going to happen. Companies want to focus, I just want to be compliant. I just want to do the accounting. But they have to do more than that, and they don't realize that until they get into it. They're going to change their business practices. Well, the FASB has put out a tentative decision this week to defer the effective date for non-public companies. So more to come on that exactly. They have to approve it, but they've tentatively decided to push the effective date for private companies until 1/1/21. So a 365-day deferral of 842 for private companies. But that's where you can really leverage that additional time to add those value-add functions into your adoption of the standard and do a holistic approach. That's something we've really been working with our client base to look at it differently as in terms of the context of a business process change versus just adopting a new accounting standard. So that's very different.
That's a critical piece of information, especially for our clients who are, we're kind of doing a catch up here. I mean, hey, they've gotten some time to do it.
Mm-hmm.
While they're doing it, do it right, knowing that there is an opportunity to be had at the back end of it.
Yeah, speaking of do it right, we've got Riverrun's going to post to our social sites soon some do's and don'ts with the new relief that the FASB's put out. But just one note is that for those international companies, the ISB has not put out, at this point, similar relief. So their deadline remains unchanged for the international company.
The polling now just to share the results. So why is the actual lease spend reduction potential lower than the opportunity identified? Just to talk through what we're seeing here. They've gone for all the above. Udit, I presume that's
the right answer.
Yep.
I mean, all of those are one of the reasons why that lease reduction, spend reduction potential is a little bit lower than the initial opportunity identified. There are one or two cases where it might be a little higher, where the assets are not properly defined. The example that we just gave about BMW versus a BMW X3, X5, X7. So yeah, I think most of their audience got that right.
Great.
All right, so just to kind of wrap up with some of the best practices that we have, that we have talked, throughout this presentation in terms of leverage to reduce lease spend. So you want to, what the companies that are doing that the best is they identify the lowest cost vendor. In some cases, that lowest cost vendors can be from different regions for particular leased assets. And then they, once it's globally identified who the lowest cost vendor is, then you use the age-old technique that the professional procurement teams use, which is response for proposal, and you ask for several lessors to respond to the asset that you want to lease, and that gives you leverage to be able to negotiate with them. So when we help our clients with actually pulling some of these RFPs together and helping them negotiate, right away, even their existing lessor base very quickly drops their monthly lease prices to be competitive and are ready to assume some of the leases which other lessors might have at a higher monthly rates, just to get the additional volume that they can get. Like we mentioned earlier, the centralized data gives you a true negotiation power, because it lets you know that, hey, you just don't have two assets to lease, you have hundreds of assets to lease, and if it's directed to one or two lessors versus hundreds of lessors, you're going to get a much better leverage with those two. And some of the advanced levers, those are that happen when your lessors are real partners with you in terms of what they're leasing. In some cases, the buildings can be leased in a certain way that's a win-win for for both organizations, the lessors and the lessee, and so those are some of the levers that we can discuss maybe in an advanced course of this particular seminar. But those are some of the best practices that are prevalent and are becoming more and more prevalent in the lease space now that we have the focused 842 effort. So in favor of time, we're going to go to question number 4.
Great, thank you, Udit. So now this is going to be an interesting one, because now we're going to talk about negotiation strategy, and interested to see the outcome of this particular poll. But I think this definitely talks to the relationship you've got with your vendor, what kind of leverage you have. So very interested to see the outcome here. I think it's been very interesting just to go back to what you were talking about previously, about the assets that each vendor are doing, that perhaps maybe the argument for centralizing some of your lease agreements that you've got, that we've seen quite a lot of. So interested to see what everyone's thought process is around the negotiation tactics.
Looks like most of them are getting it right.
It would appear so. Okay, so yep.
Yeah. So
hey, we got a smart audience here. Everyone's
yep. So this was a little bit of a trick question, where which of the following is not a good negotiation strategy. So yes, all of them are good negotiation strategies, and they can be used either in conjunction with each other, or they can be used by themselves and very powerful at helping reduce the spend. So it's a great job in listening. We'll just summarize at the end, and then we'll open it up to Q&A if you have any in the given time. So in summary, this is a great effort. So folks who are spending time on it, and energy and resources, make it worthwhile. Get your assets configured right and noted right in the data that we're collecting to become compliant. Utilize the data-driven approach, the 3-step approach that we discussed, and involve your procurement professionals. If you don't have those team, look for support from how your lease data can then be used to actually help you reduce spend. We're talking good 5 to 15% spend reduction here. So on a $100 million base for lease obligation annual spend, that's an annual reduction of 5 to 15 million. I don't know if not that, what would give them a bigger impetus, or give you a bigger impetus in making yourself AS 842 compliant very, very quickly. And then lastly, total lease obligation should be central to all lease contracts, right? So it becomes your obligation to some extent to work your organization's resources adequately, appropriately, utilize them, so you're getting the best leases that you can from all of your assets. So with that, we'll open it up if they have any questions online. Otherwise,
yep, just opening it up to everybody on the call to ask questions through the Q&A section. You can ask anonymously. You can choose to ask anonymously if you so wish. But I think this has been a very interesting discussion. And yeah, so one question that is going to be quite interesting to answer is, do you see this process changing for the private companies? Do you see anything that might be different for private companies versus what we've seen for public in terms of negotiation power, in terms of perhaps maybe horsepower for the private companies to actually go through this process? Will they be hiring outside consultants more than doing it in-house?
Yeah. So again, I hate to give the answer. It depends. It's the spend reduction potential that drives it, regardless of a public or a private company.
Okay.
It is, as the types of asset is a more important difference, and industry is a more important difference here. So be it public, be it private, companies that have higher lease obligations are the ones who tend to go with this methodology.
Okay. Oh, because I think we're going to see quite a few differences in terms of the actual adoption, because what the FASB have noted in the change in heart around allowing some kind of relief is the fact that they don't control the amount of resource or have the amount of resource at their disposal to go through this adoption process. So I think, that might flow through to a vendor analysis as well. So that's a very interesting take on it.
Yeah.
And I think we're coming close to the end of time. So I'm just wanting to see, Michael, open up to you for any parting comments regarding perhaps maybe the relief that's been given or anything along these lines?
Yeah, I think within the context of the relief, it's really a good time to reflect on your implementation or your adoption plan. We've got 365 extra days. So if you hadn't started, you would have been under a tight time crunch, but now you've got extra time. I think it's really looking at, getting that data. You need the data, you need your leases, your information for compliance, but you're going to need it to leverage it to better manage your business and to cause positive results in your earnings and EBITDA. So great opportunity from the FASB. I think just stay the course. Don't put the pencils down, but keep moving and reassess how you're going to do it, how you're going to do it better now with the additional time.
Great. Well, thank you. A huge thank you to Michael Cahill, Udit Sharma, Managing Directors here at Riveron. If you need to contact them, the details are on our website. But thank you so much for joining this episode of Ask the Experts. More to come, and we will be sending out the recording after the fact. And enjoy the rest of your summer, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.